God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations on our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you are our rock and our liberator. Amen. So I want to spend a little bit of time fleshing out the personal and professional dynamics between Jesus and Peter, because the final chapter of John that we just heard read only makes sacred sense in the context of the rocky and righteous relationship between the two. Peter was one of the original 12 called by Jesus to drop their fishing nets and to become fishers of men. Jesus' first move with Peter was to call him by his true name. You shall be called Cephas, which means rock in Aramaic. Jesus then settled in Peter's home for a time, which included a healing of Peter's mother-in-law with a single touch. Of all the disciples, Peter was the first to walk on water, but he also became unglued on the water because of his own fear, which provoked Jesus to chastise him for needless doubt. When Jesus asked the central question, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter was the only disciple to profess Jesus' messianic lordship, saying, "You are the Christ." Yet Peter also didn't get what it meant to be Christ and rebuked Jesus for claiming that he had to suffer and die on a cross. That encounter led Jesus to refer to Peter as Satan. But obviously the fight didn't last too long, because soon after that, Peter finds himself one of 3 disciples that bear witness to the transfiguration. On the last night of Jesus' life, Peter continues to be a source of turbulence and truth. He refuses to have his feet washed, completely missing the point of Jesus' symbolic act of servant submission. Later at the dinner table, Peter says that he's willing to lay his life down for Jesus, only to be informed that he'll actually deny Christ 3 times before the cock crows the next morning. Peter is again one of 3 disciples pulled into a special revelation, this time in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus comes undone in the face of his flesh's vulnerability. And again, Peter messes up by falling asleep when he's been asked to remain awake and to pray. Later, Peter pulls a weapon on the guards at the temple, slicing off the ear of a slave against Jesus' proclamation that he must undergo what's to come without a fight. And then, just like predicted, Peter claims not to know Jesus 3 times in a row when questioned by Roman authorities. All of this, and yet Peter is the first of the 12 to be visited by the resurrected Christ. All of this, and Peter remains Jesus' chosen one when it comes to the leadership of the disciple community after he's gone. I'm trying to make a point with all of these illustrations. They had a complex relationship, Jesus and Peter. And not just a couple of rough patches. Like, the only thing that remains the same in their relationship is that they are constantly negotiating Peter's humanity vis-a-vis Jesus' divinity. There is a lot of disappointment. There is a lot of doubt. There is misbehavior, disagreement, abandonment, jealousy, betrayal, and conflict characterize the relationship. And there is recognition, real flesh and blood intimacy, faithfulness, loyalty, miraculous transformation, tenderness, trust, and love. The hard and the good don't happen in phases between them. They are woven together throughout the relationship, throughout the story, in and between those two who, along with Paul, made possible the very church we all claim today. I don't know about you, but I take a rather large dose of comfort from this story because I don't think it's just about Peter and Jesus. I think it's about humans and God. Feels like we can find our own stories in Peter as individuals and as the institutional church. Perhaps the only thing that remains the same in our relationship is that we are constantly negotiating our humanity vis-a-vis God's divinity. And while some of us may have internalized a fairy tale version that the life of faith is about comfort and stability and ease all of the time, most of us will admit that it's about those things some of the time, but a lot of the time there's confusion, doubt, and despair too. What exists between Peter and Jesus exists between us and God. The full spectrum of experience and emotion. And what's beautiful and encouraging about this story and about their relationship is that it doesn't end with God giving up or giving in or getting tired of Peter's foibles and failures and denial. It ends with an open question, a question that lets Peter decide what the nature of the relationship will be moving forward. It's a question that puts all the power in Peter's hands and heart. Do you love me? That's the question. Do you love me? When I was at Long Beach about a month ago, I had the privilege of hearing Reverend Martin Copenhaver preach from the General Synod floor. He's got celebrity status in the United Church of Christ, and so I was quite excited to be in the presence of preaching greatness. He preached for about 30 minutes, but something in the first 2 minutes of that sermon gripped me hard and hasn't let me go since. Reverend Copenhaver concocted a numerical statement that struck me spiritually profound. Now, let me be clear that I passed math by the skin of my teeth in high school and college. My brain doesn't do fractions or equations, and geometry is an altogether hopeless ordeal. So you are not hearing from a mathematician here, you're hearing from a theologian. But even I know a powerful statistic when I hear one. And this one was about Jesus, so I was listening more closely than usual. Here it is. In all of the Gospels, Jesus asked 307 distinct questions. How many? 307. But gave only 8 direct answers to the more than 183 questions he was asked. And here's the kicker. Jesus was nearly 40 times more likely to ask a question than to give an answer. Jesus was nearly 40 times more likely to ask a question than to give an answer. Do you love me? If Peter represents all of us in highs and lows, his faithfulness and failures, his beauty and blundering, then Jesus represents God, who is 40 times more likely to regard us with a question than an answer. But I don't think many of us have been conditioned to view God this way. In fact, I think many of us have been conditioned to think of God as the ultimate answer, capital A, and answer provider. What if it's the reverse? What if God is the ultimate question, capital Q, and question asker? Do you love me? If your life came into question right now, if you and God sat down over coffee, and God looked you square in the eye and asked you this question, do you love me? What would your answer be? I imagine that if we're being really, really honest, there'd be all kinds of answers in this very room to that question. Some would give unequivocal yeses, but I bet some might say maybe, or I don't know, or you don't make enough sense for me to answer that question. And others might say, I used to love you until my kid died, or my spouse cheated on me, or I got diagnosed with this disease that ruined my life, and now I can't stand the thought of you. Some might not even have words to answer. And you know what? No matter, as we see in the life of Peter, God will keep asking, do you love me? We are in the spiritual season of harmony, making our way through the three movements of Brian McLaren's Naked Spirituality. He says that the spiritual practice of saying yes to God is how we come into harmony with ourselves, with each other, and with the one in whom we live and move and have our being. McLaren says that saying yes means two things: a calling of commission and a calling of communion. It's a life of service and a life of suffering. In John's 21st chapter, it says it plain, if you love me, follow me into suffering, even to death. And McLaren expounds on that, saying the purpose of the spiritual life is not simply to connect us more deeply to God, it must connect us more deeply to our neighbor, reflected in Jesus' words, feed my sheep. We come now to the great love evoked in the word yes, a love that cannot separate God and others, but rather that loves God in others and others in God, saying to both a single yes, even to the point of sacrifice, suffering, and death, end quote. Our culture does quite a number when it comes to love. And for some reason, that slippery, seductive number makes its way up into the church all too often. Somehow, we conceive of love as a feeling, as something that we experience internally. And as long as we feel it inside, then we must be good. But that's not gospel. That's individualistic sentimentality stripped of what makes love sacred. Feed my sheep, tend my lambs, follow me. Love is a verb, and it's only tangible in the actions of service and suffering. If we aren't serving others and suffering with others, our answer to the incarnate life, to the eternal love offered by Jesus Christ isn't yes. We may feel like our answer is yes, but the life of faith isn't about feeling, it's about action. Faith without works is dead. In college, I read a book that deeply imprinted on me just how complex this life of Christian love and discipleship can be. I had left the church long ago, rather disgusted by the discrepancies I saw between the life of Christ and the hypocrisy of his followers. Folks who thought dressing up and attending worship on Sundays met the demands of faith when the Jesus and disciples I knew lived their godly convictions among the people in the streets, confronting the conditions of their time, often at great risk to their own lives. I so badly wanted to be a Christian, but I didn't know how to be in the church without compromising my integrity. And then I met Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Apparently, he was one of my father's favorite theologians, which I didn't find out until later, but that should have come as no surprise to me, because when I read The Cost and Joy of Discipleship in my sophomore year in college, it felt like reading something that had been eternally coded in my blood. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a 20th century theologian who lived in Germany during the Third Reich. After receiving his undergraduate education at the University of Berlin and a doctorate of theology at the age of 21, he traveled to the United States, where he studied the social gospel movement with Reinhold Niebuhr and attended Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York. He also traveled to Spain and Libya, Mexico, and Cuba before being ordained and becoming a pastor. His time in the United States and other countries convinced him of two things. Number one, the church is universal. Universal. And number two, the church must confront the powers of evil in the world in an attempt to bring about Christ's peace. When he returned to Germany, Hitler quickly came into power, and young Bonhoeffer was forced to take what he learned in his travels and to apply them at home. Much of Bonhoeffer's early ministerial work took on the form of public speaking in opposition to the Nazi regime in his academic and church worlds. As things got worse and worse, he quickly realized a transcontinental movement of confessing churches opposed to Hitler was necessary. He set up underground seminaries, traveled extensively, and made contacts with any and all Christians who would take a stand, often finding people hesitant to become involved. In the mid-1930s, the confessing church became an official target of the Third Reich. Bonhoeffer's teaching license was revoked, and he was labeled a pacifist and enemy of the state. He returned to the U.S. for refuge for a short time at the invitation of Reinhold Niebuhr, but couldn't handle being away from the struggle of his people and wrote these words: "I have come to the conclusion that I made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through this difficult period in our national history with the people of Germany. I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany will have to face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make that choice from security." Upon going home, Dietrich was further harassed. He was banned from publishing, required to report his every move to the police, and he eventually became detained for conspiring to assassinate Hitler. He never considered himself an innocent martyr, but rather wrestled with the ethics of what it meant to love God and to care for God's sheep in the context of Nazi Germany. If you read his writing, you know that he felt guilty for attempting to take Hitler's life, guilt in his soul every second. But he also couldn't live with his Christian conscience watching all the degradation of human life under Hitler's power. Bonhoeffer was killed on April 9th of 1945. His life was one of endless struggle and profound faith. He is regarded as one of the most exemplary Christians to ever walk this earth, one whose theology only paled in comparison to his life lived in obedience to Christ. We hold Bonhoeffer up with reverence and high regard, and yet he attempted to take the life of another man as Christian witness, full well knowing the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." Perfect? No. Sinner? Without a doubt. And was he a saint? Yes. What is it about Christian discipleship that beckons us to say yes, even when it's messy, even when it's complex, even when it threatens the very breath God breathes into our mortal flesh? Perhaps it is because true Christian discipleship is our active response to the most powerful, alluring, forceful question in this life, the question of our love for God. One of the last things Bonhoeffer wrote goes like this: "I'm still discovering right up to this moment that it is only by living completely in this world that one learns to have faith. By this worldliness, I mean living unreservedly in life's duties, problems, successes, and failures. In so doing, we throw ourselves completely into the arms of God, taking seriously not our own sufferings, but those of God in the world. That, I think, is faith. If we say yes to God, we say yes to grace. Grace that is costly. Grace that is not cheap. That yes takes us to the heart of service and to the heart of suffering, where we constantly negotiate our humanity vis-a-vis God's divinity, like Peter, like Dietrich, like the answer we are asked to become in the face of an ultimate question: do you love me? Amen.